of the Bledisloe Cup. What a player, John Eales.
Underdogs, the Queensland Reds have won in front of over 52,000 at Suncorp Stadium.
There's a dream I feel so.
The Super Rugby competition is the largest professional rugby union tournament in the Southern Hemisphere. Rugby union saw the start of professionalism in 1996 after the successful World Cup of South Africa in 1995. The Super Rugby competition between teams from South Africa, Australia and New Zealand saw the formation of SANZAAR, the governing body for the Super Rugby and the Tri-Nations. Since the 1996, the competition grew from 12 teams to 14 in 2006 with the addition of the Free State Cheetahs from South Africa and the Western Force from Australia. In 2011 it grew with one more team in the Melbourne Rebels coming to the fore. So 2011 saw that each country boasted 5 established Super Rugby franchises. In an Australian context, the formation of SANZAAR and its competitions was a necessity in a sporting-rich country. It has given rugby a sporting market and helped that rugby union did not go missing between other publicly rich sports such as rugby league and AFL. Being broadcasted in over 41 countries and more than 10 million homes, Super Rugby is big business. In 2007, SANZAAR announced a broadcasting deal worth $323 million over 5 years. In that same year, Australia launched its domestic competition, the Australian Rugby Championship, a carbon copy of its SANZAAR partners, the Currie Cup and the ITM Cup. The Australian Rugby Championship was a major financial disaster, recording a loss of $4.7 million in only 1 year of operation. This financial loss abruptly put an end to the existence of the competition after just one season. The Australian Rugby Union's reasoning for such competition was in light of the revenue boost South Africa and New Zealand receives through broadcasting rights of their competition. The planning and business view of the Australian Rugby Championship had some major flaws from day one. Firstly, the Australian Rugby Union had to pay the Australian Broadcasting Channel a substantial fee to broadcast games, which was not even during prime-time viewing. Secondly, there was no team with an established support base. ACT, which is widely known as the Brumbies, entered the competition as the Canberra Vikings due to political influences and sponsorship reasons. Lastly, the competition was kicked off in 2007 during the World Cup year, and in effect kept all the Wallabies out of the competition, and with them all the interest and financial benefit. In 2007, another license for Super Rugby franchise was created by SANZAAR. The Australian rugby already benefited in 2004 when Western Force was introduced in Perth. In a business sense, it was a great advancement as the rich mining industry in Western Australia provided a wealth of support through personal and public sponsorship. With this in mind, the Melbourne Rebels was at the forefront for bidding for the next franchise spot. They were granted the spot in 2009 and this also increased Australian Rugby Union's reach in Australia, spreading into a previously AFL-dominated region. The ARU, through this development, the Super Rugby format was also under examination. The ARU proposed a conference-style competition. This came to realisation in 2011 and increased Australia's local derbies from 6 in 2010 to 20 in 2011, allowing the ARU to get a very similar setup to that of the failed Australian Rugby Championship, and in effect increasing local support, sponsorship and revenue. In 2011, the Super Rugby tournament would change its format for the very first time, as this clip from Fox Sports explains.
2011 is a Rugby Union World Cup year. The lead-up will feature the inaugural Super Rugby season, as 14 teams from New Zealand, Australia and South Africa become 15. Under the revamped competition kicking off in February, there'll be double the number of local derbies. The new Melbourne Rebels franchise is quietly confident.
Our benchmarks are a lot more along the standards, having very high standards and having a lot of pride in what we do. I suppose having a culture that represents Melbourne.
In round one, the Rebels will play the Waratahs, the Reds meet the Western Force and the Brumbies host the Chiefs.
Another business prospect of the new Super Rugby format allows each country to host a playoff match by their top qualifying team. This gave Australia a guaranteed playoff match to be hosted by the best performing franchise during primetime viewing. 2011 was the best year possible for the Queensland Reds, finishing the season top of the Super Rugby table. This gave them the right to host all playoff matches, including the finals, considering they did not get eliminated. With this honour, the Reds attracted sold-out crowds for both the semis and finals versus the Crusaders. An increase of 60% on their crowd figures was shown from 2000 compared to 2009. In all sporting codes, there is always the political climate to contend with. SANZAAR is the collective body of all three nations. However, for SANZAAR to make a decision, it needs to take into account each union's opinion. Australia highly favoured the new formation as it would allow for more local derbies. The complex issues were to get New Zealand Rugby Union and South African Rugby Union on side with the idea, as both have their own domestic competitions to consider and the implications that may result. Also, another big issue in Australia is that rugby union is not a nationwide sport. The franchises now owned by the Western Force and the Melbourne Rebels had major political implications. The Western Force was a masterstroke by the ARU, whereas Melbourne Rebels franchise was bidded for by 5 other Australian businesses. The political resolution to grant the Rebels entry was as much a business decision as it was a political one. The ARU knew if they wanted to increase the game's popularity, they would have to stretch the reach of the game into new regions. So to cover all the main points, Super Rugby is a necessity for Australian rugby to keep the game alive. The new conference-style format improved revenue, popularity and primetime viewing in Australia. The Australian playoff matches was also an important development and resulted in 2 sold-out crowds at Suncorp. The 2 new franchises created by the ARU have helped the game to spread Australia-wide.